I'm going to talk a bit about research impact, why it matters, and what we want to do about it. So the TLDR at the top is that researchers are graded on how they influence primarily, and that influence is a qualitative narrative. So if you're not on board with this yet, or you're a bit confused, hopefully by the end of the talk here, you'll understand where I'm coming from and find some usefulness for your own work. So first, we're going to go over what is impact. We'll talk about the framework. We'll talk about who cares about what pieces of impact. And then we'll spend a while talking about developing your research narrative and breaking down just what that means. I also want to say at the top that I'm an individual contributor, and I'm also working in-house, not as a consultant. I think the framework still works, but some pieces might be more or less emphasized depending on if you're a manager versus IC, or if you work in consulting versus in-house. But I think a lot of this is still going to apply. But just want to say there are other lenses to view this from, but this is the one that I'm bringing in particular from my experience. So first, let's start with the model. This is the model that I came up with for research impact. These are the different types of impact there are. There's execution impact, influence impact, and outcome impact. And I didn't come up with these out of thin air. I looked at all of the other frameworks for research impact that I could find over about the past 15 years. A lot of them came up just in the past few years, and I did my best to integrate the ideas from all of those frameworks. And one thing that I thought was cool is one of the ones I relied on in particular came out with a version 2 right as I published this. And it had almost the exact same chunks with just slightly different names. And the more I talked to people that hadn't published anything but have worked in research for a while, they tend to similarly group the types of impact as I've grouped them here, again, with probably slightly different names. But I think it shows that we're getting a little bit closer to that kind of underlying truth of the kinds of impact that there are for researchers, UX researchers specifically. I think the piece that I'm bringing here that might be a little bit different is I took a systems thinking approach, and I designed where these lines are cut out between all the three types around the locus of control, which is where does the researcher have control over the impact, and where do they kind of give it over to other stakeholders. So we'll break down this in detail right now. So let's start with execution impact. This is how researchers begin, execute, complete their projects, and sometimes support their team. So this is just the basics of doing UXR work. Planning your studies, running them, analyzing, sharing them out. All of these things are core to how we do our job. This can also include some adjacent things like getting project requests, getting invites to meetings to share out, things like that that can show visibility or just that people are, starting to pay attention to research as a function. Ultimately, though, the locus of control here is the researchers. They're the ones that are fully in control of how they plan, run, analyze, and share their studies, or in some cases, it's being given to the researcher, like when you get a project request. The next phase is influence, and this is how we as researchers cause a change in other actors' decisions. And this could be a lot of different things. It could be a very formal citation in a roadmap of research you did. It could be a little squishier, like reforming the company's understanding of a key user area. And you might see that emerge as things like creating new jargon where people are suddenly referencing your personas by name. Whether or not they know that you made them, you know you came up with those names and you're seeing that influence on people, even if you don't have that formal roadmap citation. So this is where we start to move the control from the researcher to the stakeholder. You control maybe where you share and maybe who's in the room, but you can't control entirely if they're going to listen to you. So that's where you're kind of shifting that control, hoping you do a good enough job that those people are moved in a certain way to take your insights, digest them, and do something differently because of them. The last phase or type of research impact is outcome impact. And this is how those other actors, other stakeholders are measuring the success of their actions. And hopefully those actions are caused at least part by the research that we've done. So this is the success that stakeholder is judged on. It could be user growth, it could be revenue, it could be time to close support tickets. It could be anything that the person listening to your research needs to do and what they're judged on. This is firmly in the stakeholders' locus of control. Again, we may have exerted some influence previously, but we don't own these outcome metrics. We're not judged on those metrics in particular. So this is fully out of our control as researchers. So that's how I kind of chunk up these different areas. So you can kind of see a natural progression here as it starts with the researcher control. We kind of move into the stakeholder control. We're kind of handing it off. And then finally, it's fully in the stakeholders' control. So these are the three buckets that we have for types of research impact. But who cares about these types of impact? It kind of depends on what persona we're talking about. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to keep in two very broad buckets. The first is the UX researcher, and the second is the business stakeholder. And this could be the CEO, it could be a call support manager. It's most likely probably a product manager if you're a UX researcher, but it could be any variety of people that aren't doing the research themselves. So let's start with the business stakeholder and what they care about. They care about their outcomes. They own an outcome. Again, revenue, user growth, support tickets, whatever it might be, that's what they're on the hook for. And they need to make a decision to improve the success of their goal. And research, of course, the fundamental purpose is to help them de-risk that decision making. They have kind of an infinite number of paths, which is the best one that they should take so they can better meet the goal that they have set out. So ultimately, these stakeholders really just care about their goal. They don't care as much about the process that helps them get there for its own sake. So, thinking about things like how we execute our research, they probably want to know that we're good at our jobs, but they don't really care about execution impact. It doesn't really matter to them. What they're on the hook for is that ultimate goal that hopefully our influence helps them achieve that better outcome, whether that's more users, more revenue, faster time to close support tickets, whatever that might be. So, stakeholders, business stakeholders, they're most involved with research at the influence phase when we kind of hand off everything that we've executed to them to go forth and make their decisions. But they own that outcome phase. That's what they care about the most. That's what is most important to them and most important to the business as a whole. So we know that this outcome impact is really, really important to the people that are running the business, deciding the headcount. So why don't we just measure outcome impact? Wouldn't that make sense if we just focus on what our stakeholders care about the most? Well, there's a couple of reasons that this is challenging or doesn't quite make sense. The first is that the last phase that we own as researchers is influence. And the second piece is that measuring this outcome impact is pretty hard, or in some cases, not even possible. And if you've ever tried to link your research to metrics like revenue growth, I'm sure you understand how challenging that can be to draw the line clearly. So we'll start with the first piece, that the last phase that research owns is influence. When a key metric isn't met, it's a product manager who's on the hook for that result, or the CEO, or the support chat manager, whoever they might be. They don't come to research and say, hey, we didn't hit our metrics and this is going to affect your performance review. We're not on the hook for that. The product manager is. UX researchers, we're graded on influence and how other people listen to the work that we do. And I'll dig a lot more into this later on, but simply put, this is a judgment that's made in performance evaluations most of the time through things like career ladders or other expectations. So this is ultimately what we are graded on as researchers because it's the last phase that we own as a function. So the fact that research owns influence is one reason we don't focus as much on these outcome metrics when we're trying to talk about the impact that we have as researchers. The other piece is that measuring outcome impact is hard, or in some cases, it's not even possible. So these are the four reasons that I have for why measuring outcome impact is hard or not possible. And I'll walk through each one of them right now. First, research is deliberately far from metrics. We have the current state where we're deciding what we want to do. Hopefully, research helps to narrow down the paths. And then we have that future state where we can actually measure that outcome impact. And we're deliberately far from that future state. If we were already at the place where we could measure outcome impact, we wouldn't need research because we would just react in real time to those metrics. So we exist to be very far away from all the work that is between the future state where we can measure outcomes and right now before we've undertaken all that work and we want to choose what work to do. So it's kind of inherent to our function that we're really far away from those final metrics when we're actually executing our work. Also, we deal with counterfactuals, things that don't actually happen, and hypotheticals. When we recommend a path, we typically don't recommend a few other paths. Like if we were looking at a number of designs, we don't have engineering build out the design we think will work the best and also the two that we think won't work the best. That would be kind of a wasted effort. But that means we can't measure how those ones we think would be worse actually would perform. So we can't measure the things that we recommend people not to do. And sometimes really good, really impactful work is just a no recommendation finding. We say, don't do whatever you're going to do because we think it would be really bad, even if there isn't a recommended path other than continue with the status quo. These are really important pieces of work, but we inherently cannot measure that outcome impact. You can't measure how much revenue something has for a feature or product you've never built. So, what's the takeaway from these first two pieces where we actually cannot measure that outcome impact? We see a lot of times in building resumes, trying to sell ourselves, that you need to show those hard metrics. I think for a lot of mature research teams, they understand that every project is not going to have outcome measures for their impact. Some of them can, and it's great when you have it, but I don't sweat it when every project I have doesn't have a direct line to revenue or user growth. That's really challenging, and in some cases it's not possible. That said, when I do get it, it's great to have. The other piece is that communication and visibility deteriorates over time. When you're doing your work right now, when they're actually making that final measurement in the DS metrics or the revenue metrics, whatever they might be, you've probably pivoted on to two or three other projects. If your team is distributed across a lot of different product pillars, then you might have not even met with those stakeholders since you had to get on to the other team that you had in the queue for the important work that they needed to be done. So you have less visibility into those meetings that are going on. Things get more granular as engineers are kind of finalizing last details of the code. You're probably not going to be in those meetings. You don't have time because you are just doing other hopefully good research work. So it takes a lot of effort to keep up and figure out what that final outcome measure is. So it helps to keep in touch with your product manager, your data science friends. Use things like an impact tracker to help organize and make sure you can kind of, stop that deterioration as much as possible. But it does take effort, and I'll talk about the ways that I do that later in this presentation too. Lastly, impact diffuses over time, which is kind of a fancy way of saying even if you are a generative researcher that's done all of the work to come up with a brand new idea for a line of business, by the time that idea is shipped, you'll have had many people that have been involved, from a product manager to engineers, marketers, designers, etc. So even though you came up with it and it wouldn't exist without you, by the time it gets to the end, it's a little bit muddy because so many people have been involved. So what do you do about this? You just have to claim that impact. And I think a lot of us are very cautious about causality and being academic in the way that we make rigorous claims about our research. But when we're talking about impact here, we're more selling a narrative. We're not talking about the ultimate truth or the state of the world. We're just trying to say that our work was important. So you need to make sure you claim that impact and don't overstate things. But if you had an important role or an essential role, you need to talk about that, even if many other people have been involved by the time you get to the end of it. So what we've learned so far is that outcome impact is the most important to the business stakeholder, but this impact is hard or sometimes not possible to measure. So what do we care about as researchers? What impact matters the most? This is the part that I think is probably most important. First of all, we care about execution. This is the foundation of our craft. This is what we spend all of our time upskilling on as we, go to school or go to training or even learn on the job. This is the foundation of our work. We also care about this because it leads to better outcomes when we do it well. If you execute very often but with low rigor, then you're not really going to see better outcomes because of it, because the findings you have aren't aligned to a useful reality for your stakeholders. They don't really understand the truth of the situation any better. So we ultimately care about execution because we want those outcomes to be good in the end as well. And we care about influence because this is what connects our execution to those final outcomes. If we do really great work, nobody listens to us, then it doesn't really matter because it will have no impact on those outcomes. So we need to make sure that obviously we're sharing our work, people are paying attention to us so they can use it to make better decisions. We also care about influence, like I said before. This is what we're graded on. This is the final phase that we own, I think, in a lot of mature companies. Perhaps some companies kind of force that outcome metric connection, but I don't think that's most typical. And then we care about outcomes too. We care about outcome impact. Two big reasons. One, we might just care about the shared organization of the shared goal of the organization. We might believe in the product we're building or whatever service we're providing. But also, if the outcomes aren't good, then the company won't do well and we'll have to find a new job. So, we want our organization to succeed ultimately. And I think this is true of, every single function across any company, that you want the company to be successful. So we've talked a little bit now about who cares about what kinds of impact, and I want to get more into measurement. And you'll see on the next slide that I put measure in quotes because I want to unpack what that term really means and what we get out of measuring impact in particular. So we can count the number of types of impact that we have. So the number of studies we executed, the number of roadmaps that we influence, things like this. I see this a lot in other writings about impact and how we want to measure it. I don't think this is quite right, especially at the IC level. This doesn't really provide us with a useful lens. When we just have, I did 6 studies last quarter and I was on 5 roadmaps, it's sort of like, so what? What story are you telling me? What does that really mean? In all of the review processes that I've seen at every company, it's never just having the most roadmaps influence that gets the best review because it matters which roadmaps did you influence? How important was that project? What's the story behind each of those citations that you had? Simply aggregating the number isn't really useful. It doesn't get you what you need in the end. So I think it's important to emphasize that we're looking for quality over quantity. This is to say we're looking for better impact rather than just more impact. And this is because ultimately the impact that we're looking at is it's a narrative and it's not just a number that we count up and whoever gets the most of those kinds of impact wins. So, impact is this qualitative narrative of the work you did. Most of the time, maybe unless you work at a startup that doesn't have a lot of processes yet, it's a document used for your performance review, as tangibly as I can put it. That's where your impact lives in the way that you're judged as a researcher. And this is how you tell the story of the way that your work made a difference. And so, what I want to talk about now is how you actually develop this research impact narrative, because this is how your performance is judged when you do your work. So let's talk about it. First, you need to keep track of what you're going to use to build your narrative. So you need to keep track of all of this disparate information across all of these projects about what you did, who you influenced, how you can prove that, what ultimately happened. I use a research tracker and I take tons of screenshots and I grab links whenever I can along the way. Um, I have a link that I'll share out after, but it's really just a simple spreadsheet. You can add some extra detail, but you essentially start with the project and then you track all of the little bits of impact that you have along the way. And the story just starts to emerge naturally. You can kind of see how this relates to the original model too. You have execution impact up front. What did you do? Where did you share it? And then you have that influence impact. Maybe you get a comment from an engineer about how they're going to use your work, or you're formally cited in a roadmap. And then if you're lucky and that product ships and you have the ability to see the outcomes, maybe you can even tie it back to, say a 5% increase in user retention if that's what the feature was related to. So you kind of have this natural progression, and you would lose all of this story if you just kind of count up the number of share outs you did or the number of roadmaps you were cited in. That doesn't really help you tell your story, which is ultimately what you're trying to do. Like I said, I'll share these slides out after, and you can find the tracker template in this link. And I want to talk about influence and outcome impact in particular, and how you kind of find information that you need to develop your impact narrative. You have to go out of your way to ask sometimes. This used to feel really awkward to me to kind of ask about my own work. It felt maybe a little bit presumptuous, but there's a lot of ways you can do this with keeping it kind of casual and just leading with a natural curiosity. I think as researchers, we often want to know what happens to our work. I know I do. That's one of the most satisfying things from executing the work, is seeing who's listening to it and what they're doing with it. So I'll go out of my way to ask people, hey, did this research influence your thinking on this project? I'm just looking to see where my work has been most helpful, and people are happy to fill in, where you've influenced them, and it's not awkward at all. Even though sometimes I kind of second guessed it when I started to be more direct about this, and I'll also ask about how experimental results turned out. Like, I'm curious naturally, but also I'm going to use this for my impact narrative. And if you have the access to it, get familiar with your A/B test tooling. You can figure out what the experiments are, and they're pretty simple metrics to read, what the winner or loser is of certain experiments, and just a couple p-values you got to wrap your head around, and you can figure out what that final outcome impact was for something like user retention. And as you're gathering all of this information up to make your narrative, it's important to figure out value. First, you need to figure out how is the value defined for your impact. In more mature organizations, you'll have something like a formal career matrix where they'll say everything you need to be doing and kind of what outcomes they want to know within your position, within your level. There's also individual preferences. Whatever your manager does, they may care about certain pieces more. They may just, like to see certain kinds of impact in a certain kind of way. And it's good to be aware of this and make this explicit in your mind so you know how you need to note things and argue for things to be most successful in arguing for your impact. And when you know what's defining it, then you can figure out what exactly is valuable. Can the influence be more formal or informal? Like, do you need a roadmap citation, or can you just have a talk with somebody and say, yeah, I talked with them and they're using it in XYZ way? This is going to matter how you take notes and how you write about it in the end. Some companies also care a lot about outcome metrics. Again, I think that's it's challenging and it's not always applicable, but if that's what the company really needs to see, then you may have to think about the work that you do. Will it lead to outcome metrics, and spend that extra time tracking it because that's ultimately valuable for your impact. And then there's some kind of adjacent stuff, like there are companies that really care about how you support other people. Like, do you help unblock them, help teach them new skills, or maybe they want to see that you grow in your own skills. So these are all things to be aware of. Figure out how you're being graded. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, what are you trying to do? What do you value? Are you trying to get a promotion? There might be a very specific way in the career ladder that you need to achieve that, the kinds of impacts you need to demonstrate. Maybe you're looking to grow your skills, and that's also going to change what impact you're looking for and how you choose your projects. Maybe you're just looking to be consistent and you just want to hit what you need to every quarter. Well, figure out what that is so you don't underdo it and you don't overdo it. But figure out what you value, and that will help bring into focus what you need to be working on throughout the half or the quarter or the year to make that impact. So let's talk a little bit about how each of these kinds of impact come into the actual narrative that you're writing. So first is execution impact. This is least important to the business. I'm a researcher. I consider myself a methodologist. I just love getting into the weeds of how we do our work. Most people at the company don't care about that at all, and that's fine. We still have to care about it. Like, we need it for good outcomes ultimately, but this is not something to go into great depth in your narrative about. This is mostly just setting the stage for the influence, impact, and maybe outcome impact it if you have it as well. I'll also say, going back to that idea of quantifying the number of projects you've done, I would say over a year, probably 20% of my projects give me 80% of my influence impact. It's not like one project has the exact same amount of influence impact as any other project. Some are really outsized. So I really don't rely or aim to figure out how many projects I need per quarter. Of course, if I'm maybe only doing one per quarter, there's probably a lower limit there, but there's certainly a way where you can do too many and you're not getting that impact because you're not spending enough time choosing the right projects, socializing them in the right way to get that influence. So I really focus on the right projects rather than just the number of projects when I can. And then also consider what else your team values. Maybe you need to spend extra time helping unblock your peers, helping them upskill. Maybe you need to work on visibility if your company really cares about, showcasing research, even though that maybe not be influenced directly. If that's an execution that's important to your company, it's good to be aware of that so you can note it in the narrative that you create. And then we have influence impact. This is probably the bulk of your impact document. And this is pretty much, I would say, always the case. Even if you have outcome metrics, most of it is still going to be influence. This is the thing that we're most importantly graded on. This is the final phase that we own. So this is really crucial. This is where I spend most of my time trying to spend effort initially documenting so I can bring it into this narrative when I need to. I'll also say too, this is probably a little too deep. We're kind of going a little tangent here, but I reference this a lot. This is from Dave Hora's Researcher's Journey article, and it is excellent. And I'm bringing it up now because I want to say that this influence impact becomes more and more critical as you become less junior. As you're more junior, you might just be, reviewing the data, doing kind of basic data analyst functions, and then more mid-level, you're really needing to figure out what are the actionable outcomes, what are the actionable steps people can take based on those insights. But as you're more senior, you need to ensure that people are actually doing something about it. It's not just enough to make the insight a recommendation. You have to help see that that's followed through and ensure coherent action. So this is a great skill to always be learning, always be focusing on, because as you become more senior, this influence piece is the most important. And then we have outcome impact. This is most prized by the business. We don't own this, so it's not necessarily something we're directly graded on. But if you have the ability to track it, definitely claim it, even if a bunch of other people worked on the project by the time it launched. If you had some influence there and that led to good outcomes, you want to lean heavily on that because it just tells a nice narrative. And especially if you're working on something like a resume rather than like an internal impact narrative, I think this shows kind of a business sensibility when you have it. At the same time, uh, don't try and draw a line that's too shaky to it because I think that's sort of like, wait, how did you get from point A to point B? People can kind of sniff test that too. So if you have it, claim it, but don't overstate it at the same time. So we've talked now about kind of what types of impact are important, and we've talked about how we kind of put those together in a research narrative. But I kind of want to look at this process from a bigger point of view and how this all fits together, doing research from end to end. So if you want to make an impact, you have to choose the right projects. And it's easy to just think, well, this would be really important for the business to know. Let's invest in it. Let's avoid doing something that isn't important. This misses a really critical dimension, and that is related to how influential you can be, how much influence impact you can have. And that is what I would call activation, which is, are your stakeholders going to activate the work? Are they going to do something about it? So even if something's really important to the business, if there's no chance that anybody's going to do anything about it, you probably don't want to do that work. Or you need to realign stakeholders to see the importance of it, but it's not enough to just invest in it on its own. At the same time, I'll talk about this more in a second. There is value in kind of seeing that your work will maybe hit down the road. So the activation doesn't have to be instantaneous. It can be kind of a slow burn, but you have to recognize that ability to activate on. But when work is likely to be activated on by your stakeholders and it's important, that's really the sweet spot that you want to hit. So it's not enough to be important. You need to have that activation there too. And even if it will be acted upon, but it's not that important. Again, it's not just the number of roadmaps you influence. So if you influence a roadmap, but it's something that like nobody in the business really cares about, even if people did some work on it, then that doesn't tell the best story. So you really want to find things that are important and have a high chance for activation too. And as we're doing this work that is likely to lead to impact, we have the importance piece, we have the activation piece, we have to choose our targets properly. See if you can choose your stakeholders wisely too. And this kind of plays right into that activation idea as much as you can. Sometimes you have your PM, you can't change it. That's who you're working with, and that's what you got to go with. But a lot of times we work across a lot of pillars, and maybe we have two projects come to us, they're equal importance. You might want to choose the one that has the stakeholder who's going to work better with you. This is kind of politicky, so it might feel that way, but ultimately it's going to lead to more impact if you're working with a stakeholder who understands the value of research and knows how to act on it. So choose your stakeholders wisely as much as you can. We don't always have that luxury. And then also do what the team needs, not just what they want. I think we do this all the time with users. We think about what they're saying to us, but we also kind of investigate their behaviors and we think about what's the need that's kind of between the lines of what they're saying they want. These are not always the same thing, so you have to think carefully. If they come to you with a specific ask, try and figure out the why behind the ask and make sure you're getting to what the team ultimately needs, because that's going to lead to real influence, real change in behavior. And more to that last piece, I just want to talk quickly about this idea of strategic research. When you have a PM that's maybe on the hook for some very specific metrics, they're really focused in on just like what is within their scope of feasibility over the next quarter, what's going to move this one little metric, and they're kind of optimizing for this local maximum. They're trying to get this metric up as high as they can within their smaller view. I think one of the superpowers we have as a researcher is that we can kind of step back. We're not on the hook for metrics, so we can look a little bit bigger. And even though that can be a challenge at times, we also get this superpower where we can look at that full view of the problem because we're a little bit unburdened by being directly on the hook for metrics. So we can start to zoom out and say, yeah, we could do this, but we could also look for this more global maximum that may not be directly focused on your minor metric, but it's actually going to move a whole suite of metrics, yours included, and that's going to be more beneficial for the business in the end and tells a really good story. So, probably the bulk of your time is more tactical questions dealing with things that are direct asks from stakeholders fit neatly into roadmaps. But I always try to spend at least a little bit of time each quarter doing strategic work that might have a, kind of longer time horizon for activation, but I know will be valuable to the team. And it really tends to be the work that they need and they're not asking for at all. But those have, kind of big splash effects that have a lot of influence across a lot of different teams rather than just the one direct PM you're working with. And as you define the right projects, you're executing them well. This whole time, you need to be tracking your impact. The whole time, you need to be gathering materials for your narrative. Track your projects, everything related to them, and all of the outcomes that you have from it. The influence impact, the outcome impact, and you want to make this as easy as possible. So if you have like a really advanced spreadsheet that has all these extra drop downs for each type of influence or outcome impact that you're doing, um, you're probably not going to be compliant with that. It's going to be too much effort in the moment. So I have this spreadsheet. I use it a lot, but I also just have a folder called impact and I'll screenshot something that I see and just throw it in there totally unlabeled. It's much easier to kind of just have a unorganized repository for all this impact than track down a Slack conversation from 4 months ago if you don't have a Slack retention policy that's going to eat it anyway. So make it really, really easy to just capture those moments. You can do the organization later on. And like I mentioned earlier, too, sometimes you got to follow up with your stakeholders. You need to go out of your way to ask them, hey, how are you using my work? How did this help you? And this is going to be important for gathering those materials. When you're actually writing your narrative, remember that you're writing to prove a point. You're not writing an exhaustive document. You're not writing in every detail. This is a persuasive document. So aim for clarity over length. Keep in what drives your story. And this is particularly important for execution. We spend a lot of time on our briefs. They're really important to us. They should be, but those shouldn't show up so much in your narrative. Set the stage with that execution, but spend a lot of time focusing on your influence and your outcome impact. So cut things that don't fit into the story. And remember, you're writing to prove a point here, not to document every single thing that you did. If you go too long, then the important points get buried, and those are the things that need to stick out to whoever's reading this, your manager, maybe they're in calibrations with other managers, whoever that might be. So here's an example from one of my impact documents that I had at a company I've worked for, and it's heavily redacted, but you get the main idea here. There's execution at the front saying what I did, survey for a high visibility area, but most of this is about influence. It's talking about the way that the team has reimagined increasing a metric. It's talking about the fact that it's now a big bet in a new area of product development. And so the influence is really the bulk here. And then I kind of finish off with some execution. Visibility was important at this company. So presenting at certain forums was really crucial. So again, that's kind of that cultural layer that you need to take into account as well. This is just TLDR. I went into more detail in the main document, but I had like 2 or 3 points up top. And this kind of just shows some of the language that I'd use just as an example. And lastly, here is find your mentors along the way. You can learn a lot from other senior people on your team, or even external people that have worked in similar companies or just have a career that you admire. Reach out to them and ask them how they work with some of these things. Ask them about how you can make this impact, how you're framing it. You don't have to do this alone. And then, depending on your relationship with your manager, if you have a decent relationship with your manager, I find that it's really, really helpful to be explicit about your intents in your process. Talk to them about the impact you want to make, why you want to achieve it. Again, are you looking to grow your skills? Are you looking for a promotion? They can help you make sure that you're framing things right, focusing on the right things. They're there to help you be successful too. So be explicit about this. This is what everyone's working towards, is showing the way their work matters. And if you do work that matters, that only makes your manager look good too. So be explicit with them. Again, a little bit relationship dependent, but if it's a decent or good or great relationship, I find it is really helpful to be explicit there. So Let's wrap this up before we move into the Q&A. I think this kind of sums up the first half of this presentation pretty well. First, we have execution impact. This is the foundation for good outcomes. This is the core work we do. This is not very important to the business. It's really easy to measure and keep track of. Then we have influence. This is the final phase that we own, that we're graded on. This is more important to the business, and it's somewhat hard to measure. You still have to do some tracking down and keeping your ears and eyes open. And then lastly, you have outcome impact. This is the hardest to measure for researchers. It's the most important thing to the business. When you can get this, when it's possible, it's nice to have. Not every project will have this, so don't beat yourself up if every project doesn't have that final outcome impact. And lastly, when you're trying to make an impact, choose impactful projects. Remember importance and activation from your stakeholders. Track your impact efficiently. Make sure it's really easy to have that fertile ground to make that research narrative. As you're building all of this up, reflect on how you're being graded, what your team values, what your company values. And then when you're writing this narrative, you're writing to prove your point. So make it concise, make it clear, and make it compelling. And that's all that I have. Hopefully, by now, you would agree with me that researchers are mainly graded on how they influence, and that that influence in particular is this qualitative narrative.